Like, how do you negotiate this interface between the media, which is coming from the West and coming from an industrial technological history, also a military history and a colonized history, and then kind of using it?
It is very interesting, and it might sound contradicting. There's this podcast called Unreserved that explores the stories about Indigenous or First Nation people in what is now Canada. In one of the episodes, the podcast covers the Cree culture camp in Saskatchewan, where they teach Cree language, culture, and canoe making. And while talking about use of machinery and technology in making canoe, the Cree teacher Kevin Lewis says that his people never ever shy away from technology, and he kind of figures that if his ancestors see him not using technology, they would probably laugh at him. For instance, in my own Yaktung Nation or Limbu Nation, we have an Indigenous musician and researcher called Thebe Limbu. She's currently making new instruments inspired by Indigenous drums and horns, using machinery and technology we have today. She even incorporates Western instruments and collaborates with artist who does electronic music like me. What I'm trying to say is indigeneity is not an antithesis to technology and science. The notion of Indigenous people being backwards, primitive and against development is a very colonial perspective. We are seen as anti-development people when we obstruct projects that harms our community, environment and culture. In contrary, Indigenous people have been practicing science and technology in different forms since ancient times. It's especially evident in natural science, farming, foraging, and appropriate use of resources. You see, the crops and vegetables we cultivate now have been modified by crossbreeding and experimenting with since millennia. It's basically genetically modified plants. It's science, right? The understanding of climate and climate change and how to adapt is even more profound. The West understands the idea of climate change, but Indigenous people are experiencing it, right? So we may not understand in a way climate change is talked about in Western media and sophisticated graphs and data and terminologies, but we know it's not us. We know it has come from faraway lands. We adapt, and we have been adapting since ages. That's why we are still here despite colonization, oppression, and marginalization. I cannot imagine an Indigenous future without technology, science, or space travel for that matter. But yeah, people might say, we have to leave this kind of thing behind. It's primitive, we have to build a new future. That is totally different, which we do not go along with that narrative, because we cannot forget our past, we cannot forget our history, and we cannot forget all the dark ages of colonizations we've been through.
I guess my question was also coming a little bit from the aesthetic considerations of, what is a different way of using the same media technology? And I'm wondering if there is any difference aesthetically in your practice. How have these things played out?
I think the media I use, the things I'm inspired by at the moment, like you said, my cultures and language and the history. Aesthetically, you could totally find a difference. In the first place, I use our own Indigenous languages. Instantly you hear the sounds of the Indigenous language. And the music as well, I collaborate with Indigenous artists. And the one work we showed last year in Serendipity Art Festival, it was a collaboration with one of our respected Indigenous artists who sings in our Indigenous languages. And I also collaborate with other researchers who are doing researches in the same field. Although I use current technologies, the softwares, say Blender, animations and everything I use, there is an aesthetic element. For instance, if you see my background, you can see a mothership. It's basically inspired by an object that we use in our rituals, right? It's called Silam Sakma, which means kind of blocking the path of the death. So that object, I was inspired by that object to make a mothership out of it. Those kind of aesthetics I try to include, and the languages and sounds recordings. But yeah, like I said earlier, I cannot not associate or not work with technology.
No, I think it's precisely that merging with technology that makes it exciting and brings in this idea of futurism. Just to come back to even what you're showing me right now with your background, what's the inspiration for that? Like, is there a story behind this?
Yeah, so basically it's about the project I'm working on. It's a docufiction. It's called Ningwashum in my language, which roughly translates to memory. And the storyline goes like a future time traveler comes back in our time to look for his lost father, whose spaceship was last detected in the Himalayas. All right, so that's the one-line kind of thing. Basically, the docufiction deals with indigeneity, climate change, and science fiction. And throughout the film, I will be kind of using actual interviews from the people that I will be going up in the glacial lakes and the communities around it. The actual interviews of the locals in there. And the fictional elements that I have in mind, a time traveler and the spaceship and the mothership she comes. This is a slide, I mean, it's still from an animation I'm currently working at the moment. It's a work in progress, but I cannot wait to go there up in the mountains and do some shootings and, record some images over there.
Wow, sounds fascinating. What is MSA?
That is a space agency from the future. MSA basically means Missam Space Agency. If you see the letters, that's a script from my language, translate roughly to, say, the soul of fire. Wow. And it's an insignia. I mean, that insignia will be worn by the character in my docufiction. I mean, in her spacesuit. I mean, so it's a very ambitious project, to be honest. And I'm collaborating with many artists. And besides Adivasi Futurism, I mean, like I said earlier.
Could you tell us a little bit about the podcast as well? What is it about and how does it play into your practice?
So the podcast is called Antariksha. So Antariksha is a Nepalese podcast. It's not in my indigenous language, it's in Nepalese language that deals with science, socio-political issues, and a little bit of science fiction. In our first episode, we talk about just the importance of languages. I interviewed 4 guests, a linguist, and in the second episode, we did nanosatellites. What goes on, I mean, making a nanosatellite and how things are happening. It's all in Nepalese context, by the way. How Nepal is doing and what recently I'm working on an episode about future cities. Basically trying to imagine Kathmandu. I mean, what could Kathmandu be like in 100 years time or 50 years time?
How do you see the relationship between sort of pedagogy and, I mean, that in terms of this kind of work that you're doing with the podcast, or even when you're talking about Adivasi futurism and practice?
I always try to... It's a very difficult question, art and activism. Some people claim it, some artists claim their work as an activism, which I don't. Because for me, yeah, art does bring about changes and it does make a whole lot of difference to our society, but it takes a lot of time. I mean, it is very, very important and it lays the basic foundations of our civilizations and our community, our ethics. But it takes time. In a tangible day-to-day, our life, I think to go out there on the streets is more important than, making some artwork. On that note, in my day-to-day life, in any circumstances, when I can, physically, if I can, I go out in the streets. I help with the people. I help people on the grounds who are trying to make an actual change. So since you ask it, I'll say a little bit about the things I'm involved at the moment. Our part of the world, your world and our world, we have a huge, massive problem of this Dalit discriminations since ages, right? I'm also involved in collectives that helps the families of the murdered Dalits. We are in touch of the people, activists who are on the ground. We are in contact with them. We try to help the families and try to alleviate their situation in a materialistic kind of way, not in just theoretical things we do in the art world. I mean, So I think yes, it is. The things I do in my computer in matters, but at the same time, as a human being, for a tangible outcome, I mean, nothing is more powerful than going out in the streets and shout from the top of your lungs.